This is the beginning of a series of videos on metalwork and welding for Theater 155 Stagecraft. This is part 1, Materials. The price of metal fluctuates just like wood does. It's subject to world circumstances. In fact, most of the steel that we get nowadays in this country comes from outside of our borders. So lots of things can affect the price of steel, just like wood. Now, metal is typically stronger than wood, and it can span greater distances unsupported. So we use metal for different needs, often for strength or for long unsupported spans. Now, mild steel is the lowest carbon content of all carbon steel, which means that it's more malleable, it's easier to weld, but it's not as strong in the long term as some higher carbon content steel. But that usually is not an issue, certainly in the theater. This is the most used and most produced type of steel. It comes in different stock shapes, so shapes that you should be able to go to a steel supplier and order. And we measure the thickness of it by gauge. So on the left here is 14 gauge and on the right is 12 gauge. If you notice, the smaller the number, the lower the number, the thicker the steel. We typically use 16 to 18 gauge for theater use. So first, we also have sheet and plate steel. So sheet, we don't use in the theater that often, but you do use it sometimes. And you've seen sheet metal, usually referred to as sheet metal, even though it's often steel, but it can also be aluminum or something else as well. But sheet steel is usually the easiest to get, but you can get tin and stuff like that as well. Plate, the difference is that plate is just like sheet, but it's thicker. So, at what point does sheet become plate? I'm not sure, but usually sheet metal you can roll up and plate you could not. So plate's going to come in a big, let's say a plate. Square tube. So square tube typically is in 16 or 18 gauge. It comes in sizes. We've already seen some like 1 inch by 1 inch, 2 inch by 2 inch. Obviously, the bigger it gets, the thicker the wall needs to be, so the thicker that gauge needs to be. Now, this is actually, there's nothing here for scale, but looks like 2-inch 16-gauge square tube. So just as a reference point, that weighs 1.69 pounds per foot, so probably about 0.75 kilograms or so. As comparison, a 4x8 foot sheet of 3/4 inch plywood weighs approximately 75 pounds. So you can imagine the difference of weight using steel over wood. Now, we've already had some experience with this on this recent show, rectangular tube. Rectangular tube is what it sounds like. It is rectangular in shape. Again, typically 16 or 18 gauge. When used on edge, it is generally stronger than similarly sized square tube, which is why we tend to use it for framing things out so that they don't deflect, so they don't bend. Then we have round tube, also called pipe. In fact, more often called pipe. Schedule 40, and you can see this in the drawing there, in the illustration here, Schedule 40 black pipe is typical. That 40 refers to the strength of the wall for things other than what we usually need to use it for. Schedule 80, for example, is much thicker and much heavier. Now, when measuring black pipe or round tube, the internal diameter is what is used to measure the nominal size. And when I say nominal size, you need to know that just like wood, just like 2x4 and 1x4, what we call it is not what the actual measurement is. So if it's, as you can see here at the top of the image, 3/4 Schedule 40 black pipe. So that 3/4 is 3/4 of an inch on the internal diameter as opposed to the external diameter, or the inside diameter as opposed to the outside diameter. You'll often see ID and OD used to refer to those two things. But the nominal size, that 3/4 inch nominal size, is measuring the internal diameter of that pipe. And again, it is no longer 3/4 of an inch. So it's just really a ballpark idea of what that size is. Now, you may be wondering, well, Rob, I know that 1x is actually 3/4 of an inch thick. So what is 3/4 ID in reality on Schedule 40 black pipe? I don't know. I have to look it up if I need to know. Same thing with the outer diameter. I need to look it up because it's not something I keep in my head, and you don't need to either. So as a reference point, 2-inch, which is pretty beefy, Schedule 40 black pipe. So that is the size of the battens in our fly system, is 2-inch Schedule 40 black pipe. That weighs about 3.65 pounds per linear foot, probably about 1.5 kilos. We have channel. Typically, you're going to see U channel as pictured here, as opposed to C channel. So like the letter C and like the letter U. Channel is basically a squared off, flattened U shape. So C channel, the difference between C channel and U channel is that C channel has a higher wall. So in other words, the two sides and then the bottom, the three faces are around the same size all the way around. U channel, which is what you typically see and what's seen here, the side walls are shorter than the bottom or from that other side. Then there's angle, or sometimes called angle iron. You can see why it's called that. It is a right angle, and by the nature of how they need to manufacture it, you can see it's not a squared off rectangle. The inside of that diameter is actually a curve. It's not a right angle. Now the two faces are at a right angle to each other, but you can also see down in the corner it's rounded, and then on the top edges, the top and side edge there is also rounded. Now you can get more squared off angle iron, usually not in steel though, but you probably can find it. Then we have strap or bar, which you can see here why it might be called strap. Now, speaking of bar, however, we often have bar stock. And so this refers to solid pieces of long extruded metal. So we have flat bar. So just like what we just saw a second ago, the strap is also called flat bar. We have round bar, usually called rod. Once it gets to a certain size, you kind of stop calling it rod because it just feels bigger where you think of round stock, smaller round stock as rod. You'll often hear something referred to as pencil rod. That's actually round stock that is about the size of a pencil. Then we have square bar, exactly as it sounds, and we have hex bar. You may be thinking, okay, if we have round bar, which is kind of like pipe, and we have square bar, which is kind of like square tube, what about rectangular bar? Is there rectangular bar? Well, yeah, it's flat bar. It's the same thing, except for usually if you're going to think of rectangular bar, it's going to be much, much thicker flat bar. Then we have structural steel. So this is something that you would see holding up a building or making some really big, heavy pieces. We have channel, just like the other stock. It's just a lot beefier, made of much beefier, higher gauge steel. It's far stronger. We have I-beam, so-called because in section there you can see it looks like the capital letter I. We have rail below that. It looks like a rail for a train because it's the same thing, but we don't use it only for train rail. It can be a rail used as a track in a warehouse, or we could even use it as track in the theater if we had to. And then we have T, so-called because, surprisingly, it looks like a letter T. Then we have proprietary systems. So in other words, systems that work with themselves or specialty hardware or something like that. On the left there is telespar. Telespar is something you may see at road signs in the middle of the road. They use telespar to attach that. And it's basically square tube that has been drilled through at regular intervals so you can put bolts through there and attach things. But it's called telespar because it's also made with different size square tubes that will fit inside each other. So the tele comes like from telescoping. So it can come out of the center to make higher or longer runs, and then you throw some bolts in there to keep it in place. And then there on the right is Unistrut, sometimes just called strut. You can see how they make it, really, is it's another piece of square tube that then they have cut out one face and rolled over the inside edge. And then there are slots cut at regular intervals. So similar to Telespar, but it's got that open back. You'll see this used a lot of times with making like storage racks or something like that. And again, there are specific pieces of hardware that can come with Unistrut that go inside to make fasteners and holders and all kinds of things. And we will use this in the theater from time to time. We might use it for making platforms that come apart easily or something like that. And then finally, we have to mention aluminum or aluminum if you must. The shapes are mostly the same that you can get in steel. The difference with aluminum is it is much lighter, but it is generally weaker. So it's much easier to cut, but it is much more difficult to weld. And we can actually cut sheets of aluminum on the ShopBot, on a CNC router. It's soft enough that you can get bits to cut through it. We haven't done that at Wake yet, but it's on my list for a project, so we'll see what happens.